Have you ever wondered what really happens when a 64-year-old man and his war dog find themselves trapped in an abandoned house for an entire night, hearing sounds that defy any logical explanation? It was exactly 3 in the morning when everything changed forever in my life and that of my 4-legged companion. My name is Roberto, I'm 64 years old, and I've just had the most terrifying experience of my entire life. By my side was Zeus, my German Shepherd trained for extreme combat situations, a true war dog who has accompanied me on missions most people can't even imagine. But that night, for the first time in years, I saw fear reflected in his eyes. What began as a 20-hour survival challenge turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling that something invisible is watching your every move, every breath, every heartbeat? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you in ways you never imagined. The house we chose for our survival challenge had been abandoned for 15 years. It seemed like the perfect place to test our physical and mental endurance in a controlled environment. As a former military man and extreme environment survival expert, I thought I'd already faced everything life could throw at me. My experience in long-term challenges has always given me the confidence to overcome any obstacle, but this particular adventure taught me that age, while it brings wisdom, doesn't prepare us for all the terrors that can lurk in the darkness. Zeus, my faithful companion, has undergone rigorous military training. He was conditioned to detect danger, protect, and never show signs of weakness in the face of the enemy. During all the years we spent together facing survival challenges, he has always been my emotional compass. When Zeus is calm, I know we are safe. When he is alert, I pay extra attention. But never, in all these years, had I seen what I witnessed in that cursed house. The first signs began shortly after we established our makeshift base in what appeared to be the main room of the residence. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the air itself were too dense to breathe properly. Zeus began displaying strange behaviors I had never observed during our previous adventures. His ears twitched constantly, picking up frequencies my human ears couldn't detect. For the first 6 hours, I tried to stick to the routine established for challenges of this kind. We organized our basic equipment, established security perimeters, and divided watch shifts. But as the night wore on, a growing sense of being watched over us both, that's when the noises began. They weren't the normal sounds of an old house settling in or wild animals roaming the property. They were something completely different, something that challenged my decades of experience in extreme situations. And when I saw Zeus, my 4-legged warrior, trembling beside me for the first time in his life, I knew we were about to face something far beyond what any military training or survival experience could prepare us for. My name is William Carter. I'm 64 years old, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, a city that taught me everything about resilience and survival. I was born and raised right here, where the Rocky Mountains meet the Sonoran Desert, creating one of the most challenging and unpredictable environments in the United States. For 42 years of my life, I served in the U.S. Army, participating in special operations in terrain ranging from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East. Flagstaff isn't just my hometown, it's my school of life. Located at over 7,000 feet above sea level, this city has given me the experience of experiencing temperatures that fluctuate dramatically between day and night, sudden snowstorms in winter, and scorching heat in summer. When you grow up in a place where nature constantly tests your limits, you develop survival instincts that no military manual can teach. During my military service, I specialized in long-range reconnaissance operations and survival in hostile environments. I spent months in enemy territory, relying solely on my knowledge, basic equipment, and the partnership of trained military combat dogs. It was during one of these missions in Afghanistan, 15 years ago, that I met Zeus, a black German Shepherd with tan markings who would become my inseparable companion. Zeus is no ordinary dog. He was trained by the U.S. Army War Dog Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. His specialty is explosive detection, territorial reconnaissance, and personal protection in extreme combat situations. During the 7 years we served together in the Middle East, Zeus saved my life on at least 12 documented occasions. His ability to detect dangers invisible to the human eye borders on the supernatural. When I retired from the Army in 2010, Zeus came with me to Flagstaff. His adaptation to the Arizona climate was surprisingly quick, perhaps because we were both accustomed to working in deserts. But our partnership didn't end with military retirement. On the contrary, it evolved into something even deeper and more challenging. For the past 14 years, Zeus and I have dedicated ourselves to extreme survival challenges in the United States. We've spent 72 hours alone in Death Valley during the summer, when temperatures soar above 50 degrees Celsius. We survived a 5-day snowstorm in the Colorado Rockies using only a tarp and our knowledge of building makeshift shelters. We've walked over 200 miles across the Mojave Desert, carrying only 2 liters of water each and basic energy supplements. Our reputation as a survival duo grew organically through social media and independent documentaries produced by local filmmakers about our challenges. We weren't seeking recognition, but we ended up becoming a survival reference for war veterans who, like me, found in the wilderness a way to cope with the invisible scars left by combat. Zeus is now 13 years old, considered advanced for a German Shepherd, especially one who has lived such an intense life. But his experience and instincts remain as sharp as the first day we met. He can still detect atmospheric changes hours before any meteorological equipment, spot wild animals at impressive distances, and most importantly, remains my early warning system for dangerous situations. The house we chose for our 20-hour challenge is located approximately 40 miles north of Flagstaff in a region known as Coconino National Forest. This area is famous for its dense ponderosa pine forests, volcanic rock formations, and a history rich in Navajo Indian legends about spirits inhabiting abandoned houses. The specific property we selected has a particularly dark history. Built in 1987 by a family of German settlers attempting to establish a cattle ranch in the area, the house was abruptly abandoned in 2008 after a series of unexplained events that led to the mysterious death of the family patriarch and the disappearance of 2 of his adult children. I chose this place precisely because of its haunted reputation. At 64, after decades of facing real dangers on the battlefield, I wanted to test whether I still had the courage to deal with psychological fears and situations that challenged not only my physical endurance but also my mental stability. Zeus, as always, accepted the challenge without hesitation, demonstrating the unwavering loyalty that characterizes our partnership. Our preparation for this particular challenge took 3 weeks. We studied topographical maps of the area, consulted historical records about the property at the Flagstaff City Library, and spoke with locals who knew about the strange events associated with the house. The more we learned about the place, the more intriguing the challenge became. The equipment we brought was deliberately basic. A standard military backpack containing 2 liters of water, 2 days' worth of energy bars, a military sleeping bag, a waterproof tarp, nylon ropes, a K-bar combat knife, a lighter, a tactical flashlight with extra batteries, a basic first aid kit, and an emergency radio. Zeus carried his own backpack with 2 days' worth of food, a collapsible bowl, and a special thermal dog blanket. The decision to limit our equipment to the essentials was part of the challenge's philosophy. In real survival situations, we rarely have access to abundant resources. The idea was to simulate conditions where we would rely primarily on our knowledge, experience, and the partnerships we've developed over the years. Transportation to the property was made in my 1998 Ford F-150 pickup truck, a vehicle that has been with me for over 2 decades and has covered virtually every challenging terrain in the American Southwest. The road leading to the abandoned house is unpaved and becomes progressively more difficult as it moves away from the main highway. The last 5 kilometers required driving in first gear, navigating rocks, deep potholes, and dense vegetation that has encroached on the original path. During the journey, Zeus maintained his usual traveling demeanor, attentively observing the landscape through the window and occasionally sniffing the air coming in through the partially open window. His relaxed posture reassured me, indicating that he hadn't detected any immediate danger in the area we were traveling through. We arrived at the property at 5:45 p.m., about 15 minutes ahead of schedule. The October Arizona sun was still high, but it was beginning to take on that golden hue characteristic of late desert days. The ambient temperature was around 25 degrees Celsius, pleasant by local standards, but we knew it could drop to near 0 degrees during the early morning hours. The house's first impression was more striking than the photographs we had studied during our research. The structure, built of wood and local stone, was in an advanced state of deterioration, but still maintained an impressive architectural solidity. The windows were all broken or removed, allowing vegetation to begin to invade the interior. The roof had several gaps where rain and snow had penetrated over the years, creating dark stains on the interior walls that were visible even from the outside. Zeus jumped out of the pickup and immediately began his perimeter inspection, a pattern he'd developed during our years of military service. He circled the entire house within a radius of approximately 50 meters, sniffing the ground, nearby trees, and paying particular attention to the structure's openings. During this initial inspection, he showed no warning signs, which I interpreted as indicating that there were no dangerous wildlife or other immediate threats in the area. The interior of the house revealed an even more impressive scene. The original furniture was still present, covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. The main living room retained a working fireplace made of local volcanic stone, which would have been useful if we needed heat during the night. The kitchen still had a few utensils hanging on the walls, and an antique wood-burning stove that, surprisingly, appeared to be in good condition. It was clear that the family had abandoned the house hastily. Clothes were still strewn about the rooms, dirty dishes remained in the kitchen sink, and a 2008 calendar hung on the wall, marking September as the last month it had been used. This discovery confirmed the information we had gathered about the property's abrupt abandonment. Zeus accompanied my initial exploration, remaining close at hand but without displaying the defensive behavior he typically displayed when detecting potential threats. His calm reassured me that, at least for the first few hours, we would be relatively safe in the area. We established our base of operations in the main room, near the fireplace. This location offered strategic advantages. It had only two main entrances that we could easily monitor. The fireplace would provide warmth if needed, and the broken windows provided multiple escape routes in case of an emergency. The layout also allowed Zeus to position himself so he could observe all entrances simultaneously. Equipment organization followed military protocols we'd developed over the years. My backpack was always within reach, with essential items organized so I could locate them, even in complete darkness. Zeus received his usual early evening ration, maintaining his normal feeding routine to avoid unnecessary stress. As the sun began to set, we began our first perimeter security patrol. This joint activity aimed to thoroughly familiarize ourselves with the terrain surrounding the house and identify potential vulnerable spots or approach routes that wild animals or other threats might use at night. The landscape surrounding the property was typical of the Coconino National Forest. Mature ponderosa pines created a dense canopy that partially blocked the residual light of dusk. Volcanic rock formations rose from the ground at irregular intervals, creating deep shadows that would become completely dark after dusk. The undergrowth consisted primarily of drought-resistant shrubs and native grasses that made a distinctive rustling sound when stepped on. During this initial inspection, Zeus maintained normal behavior, investigating interesting odors and marking his territory at strategic points, as he usually did at our campsites. His body language remained relaxed, with his tail in a neutral position and mobile ears, indicating normal alertness without any signs of alarm. Dusk in Arizona comes quickly due to its proximity to the equator and the region's lack of light pollution. In about 30 minutes, we passed from the golden light of dusk to near complete darkness, broken only by the light of the crescent moon filtering through the treetops. It was at this point that our survival adventure truly began, and when the first subtle signs that something different was happening in that house began to manifest themselves in ways that neither my military experience nor Zeus's keen instincts could immediately explain. The challenge Zeus and I set for ourselves followed strict rules we'd developed over more than a decade of extreme survival experiences. The first and most important rule was that it would last exactly 20 hours, beginning at 6 in the evening on a Friday and ending at 2 in the afternoon on the following Saturday. This time window was strategically chosen to include a full night, the most psychologically challenging period, and when most of the region's natural predators are most active. The second fundamental rule was strict equipment limitations. We were allowed to carry only what would fit in our standard military backpacks, no exceptions. This meant that each item had to be carefully selected based on its multiple uses and weight. Cell phones, GPS devices, or any external communication technology were not permitted, except for the emergency radio, which could only be used in cases of real-life threatening danger. The third rule stated that we could not leave the property for any reason during the 20 hours, regardless of the circumstances. This limitation forced us to deal with any situation that arose using only our internal resources and the materials available on site. It was a realistic simulation of survival scenarios where escape is not a viable option. The fourth rule, perhaps the most psychologically challenging, prohibited the use of artificial lighting during hours of darkness, except in proven medical emergencies. This forced us to adapt our natural night vision and rely more heavily on our other senses and Zeus's superior ability to navigate in total darkness. The fifth and final rule was to fully document the experience through a detailed logbook, recording events, decisions made, weather conditions, observed behaviors, and any unusual phenomena. This record not only served as evidence of the successful completion of the challenge, but also as study material for future adventures. The choice of the abandoned house in Coconino National Forest wasn't random. We spent 3 months identifying and evaluating different potential locations throughout Arizona before deciding on this particular property. The selection criteria were rigorous and based on both practical survival aspects and psychological elements that would make the challenge truly a test of our mental limits. The first criterion was geographic isolation. The house had to be located at least 50 kilometers from any urban center and at least 20 kilometers from the nearest paved road. This distance ensured that we would not face outside interference during the challenge, and that, in the event of a real emergency, we would have to rely solely on our own resources until help could arrive. The second criterion was the presence of active wildlife in the area. We wanted a location where coyotes, wild boars, the occasional black bear, and other predators were regular inhabitants. This added an element of real danger that would keep our survival instincts constantly alert throughout the experience. The third, more subjective criterion was what we called the psychological discomfort factor. We looked for a location with a documented history of unusual events, strange sightings, or simply an atmosphere that would test our mettle beyond the purely physical aspects of survival. The house in Coconino National Forest perfectly met this requirement. The property had belonged to the Müller family, German immigrants who arrived in Arizona in 1985 with the dream of establishing a sustainable cattle operation in the region. Heinrich Müller, the patriarch, was a 62-year-old retired engineer who had invested his entire savings in purchasing the 200-acre plot and building the 2-story home. The Müller family initially prospered in the region. Heinrich, his wife Ingrid, and their 3 adult children, Klaus, Dieter, and Greta, quickly transformed the property into a functioning farming operation. They raised Angus cattle, grew corn and pumpkins, and had established strong business connections with markets in Flagstaff and Phoenix. For 21 years, the Müllers were considered respected members of the region's scattered rural community. Heinrich regularly attended Flagstaff town meetings when issues related to rural land use were discussed. Ingrid sold her organic vegetables at the local farmers market every Saturday. The children had fully integrated into American life, with Klaus even serving 2 years in the Arizona National Guard. The drastic change in the family's behavior began in the summer of 2007. Neighbors living miles away began reporting strange lights emanating from the Müller property in the early morning hours. Not the normal lights of a working farm, but intermittent flashes of unusual colors that seemed to be coming from inside the house. Heinrich, who had always been sociable and communicative, became increasingly reclusive. He stopped attending town meetings, canceled years-old business contracts, and began refusing visitors to the property. When local residents tried to visit him to check on his well-being, Heinrich greeted them at the property's entrance, clearly reluctant to allow them near the house. Ingrid developed even stranger behaviors. Flagstaff residents reported that she would appear at the farmer's market but remain completely silent, selling her wares through gestures and facial expressions. When they tried to talk to her, Ingrid would stare over their shoulders, as if constantly checking to see if she was being followed. The Müller children also changed dramatically. Klaus, who had been outgoing and popular in the community, began working exclusively at night, and neighbors reported seeing him walking around the property in the early morning hours, carrying tools and building materials without apparent purpose. Dieter and Greta simply disappeared from view, with Heinrich vaguely explaining that they had decided to travel indefinitely. The situation culminated on the morning of September 23, 2008, when a trucker making regular deliveries in the area found Heinrich Müller dead in his pickup truck, parked at the entrance to the property. The official cause of death was determined to be a heart attack, but the local sheriff noted unusual aspects of the scene that were never adequately explained. Heinrich was found with his eyes open, staring at the house, an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that paramedics had to use tools to free them. Stranger still, the truck's engine was running. The transmission was in reverse, but the brakes were fully engaged, as if Heinrich had been trying to flee the property, but something had forced him to stop. After Heinrich's death, authorities attempted to locate Ingrid and her 3 children to notify them and resolve legal issues related to the estate. Ingrid was found 3 days later in a Phoenix psychiatric hospital, where she had voluntarily admitted herself, claiming that voices coming from the house were ordering her to harm others. She remained institutionalized until her natural death in 2015, never again speaking coherently about the events at the farm. Klaus was found 2 weeks later, living in his car in a Walmart parking lot in Tucson. He had developed severe obsessive-compulsive behavior and insisted on washing his hands every 15 minutes because they would get dirty overnight. Klaus was diagnosed with late-onset schizophrenia and also spent the rest of his life in institutional care. Dieter and Greta were never found. Their bank accounts were never accessed after September 2008. Their vehicles remained parked on the property, and no relatives or friends ever received any communication from them. The FBI conducted a full investigation in 2009, treating the case as a potential double homicide, but found no evidence of foul play or clues to the missing siblings' whereabouts. The property remained in legal limbo for 6 years, while the courts attempted to resolve the inheritance issue with no traceable heirs. During this time, the house remained exactly as the family had left it, with all personal possessions, furniture, and even perishable food items creating a frozen-in-time landscape that became progressively more deteriorated by exposure to the elements through damaged windows and doors. In 2014, the property was finally auctioned off by the state of Arizona to cover unpaid taxes. The buyer was a Phoenix real estate investor who planned to demolish the house and subdivide the land for sale as rural residential lots. However, after a single visit to the property to assess the feasibility of the project, the investor changed his mind and put the entire area back on the market, at a substantial discount to the price he had paid. Over the following years, the property changed hands several times, always quickly sold by owners who never implemented any development plans or even visited the site regularly. Each transaction resulted in progressively lower prices, and the house continued to deteriorate without any maintenance or care. Local residents became increasingly reluctant to approach the property. Hunters who traditionally used the area during deer season began avoiding it altogether. Ranchers whose cattle occasionally grazed in the area reported that the animals refused to approach the house, even when there was abundant pasture available. The property's supernatural reputation grew organically through stories passed down among rural residents. Truckers using nearby roads reported unexplained lights coming from the direction of the house on certain nights. Pilots of small planes flying over the area reported visual anomalies that their cameras couldn't adequately capture. It was precisely this combination of physical isolation, a documented history of unexplained events, and a psychologically challenging reputation that made the Mueller estate the perfect choice for our extreme survival challenge. Zeus and I weren't just looking for a test of physical endurance or technical survival skills. We wanted an experience that would test our courage, our partnership, and our ability to maintain rationality and emotional control under circumstances designed to elicit primal fear. Specific preparation for this challenge began 6 months before the scheduled date. We extensively studied the region's topography using detailed geological maps provided by the United States Forest Service. We analyzed historical October weather patterns in the area, consulting meteorological data from the past 20 years to predict likely conditions during our stay. We conducted 3 reconnaissance visits to the property during the months leading up to the challenge. The first visit was during the day, focused on assessing the physical structure of the house, identifying entry and exit points, and mapping relevant topographic features in the surrounding terrain. The second visit was at night, allowing us to experience the visibility and acoustic conditions we would face during the actual challenge. The third reconnaissance visit was the most extensive, a 4-hour stay during a rainy weekend to test how adverse weather conditions would affect our ability to use the structure as an effective shelter. During this visit, we identified that the roof had several significant openings, but that the main living area remained relatively dry due to the protection offered by the stone fireplace and the thicker walls in this section of the house. Also, during this third reconnaissance visit, Zeus showed his first subtle signs of discomfort with the surroundings. While he didn't display full alert behavior, he remained closer to me than usual, and occasionally stopped abruptly to stare in directions where I couldn't identify anything unusual. These behaviors were subtle enough that I initially interpreted them as normal reactions to a new environment, with many unfamiliar odors of wild animals and organic decay. The final decision to proceed with the challenge at this location was made after a careful analysis of the risks versus benefits. The physical risks were manageable given our experience and adequate equipment. The psychological risks were precisely what we were seeking as a test of our mental and emotional limits. The opportunity to face irrational fears in a controlled environment, where we knew we could escape if a real emergency developed, represented a valuable form of personal growth and strengthening of our partnership. The final gear selected for the challenge reflected decades of experience in real-world survival situations. Each item had been extensively tested in previous challenges and had multiple functionalities to maximize its usefulness within the weight and space constraints of our backpacks. My main pack contained 2 liters of water in military-grade aluminum bottles, 6 high-calorie energy bars, a military-grade sleeping bag rated for temperatures down to -15 degrees Celsius, a 3-meter by 2-meter waterproof tarp, 20 meters of nylon climbing rope, my K-Bar combat knife with a 20-centimeter blade, a military-grade waterproof lighter, an LED tactical flashlight with 3 sets of spare batteries, a basic first aid kit including bandages, antiseptics, and pain medication, and an emergency radio capable of transmitting on distress frequencies. Zeus's backpack contained 4 pounds of his usual military rations, divided into 2 days' worth of portions, a collapsible silicone bowl, a thermal blanket specially designed for military dogs, and an ID collar that included my contact information and basic medical instructions in case of an emergency. In addition to the gear in our backpacks, we did a final check of the pickup truck we would use to get to the location, ensuring it had enough fuel, tires in good condition, and a vehicle emergency kit that included basic tools, jumper cables, and additional water supplies that would remain in the vehicle as a backup. The weather window chosen for the challenge was also carefully selected. October in Arizona offers moderate daytime temperatures, but nights can be surprisingly cold, especially at high elevations like the Mueller property. This temperature variation would add an element of physical challenge without creating extreme risks of hypothermia or hyperthermia. The moon phase was also considered. We scheduled the challenge for a night with a waxing moon, providing moderate natural light that would allow us to navigate the exterior of the house without using artificial lighting, while still maintaining deep shadows that would create the psychologically challenging environment we were seeking. Finally, we checked extended weather forecasts to ensure we wouldn't encounter severe storms or other weather conditions that could turn a controlled psychological challenge into a real survival emergency. Forecasts indicated stable conditions, with the possibility of moderate winds overnight, ideal conditions for our purposes. With all these preparations complete, Zeus and I were ready to face 20 hours in the abandoned Mueller family home, unaware that we were about to experience events that would challenge not only our courage and survival skills, but our very understanding of what is possible in the natural world. At 5:45 p.m., when our Ford F-150 pickup finally pulled up in front of the Mueller family's abandoned home, Zeus and I followed the protocol we'd developed over years of survival challenges. The first step was always a 5-minute pause inside the vehicle to fully observe our surroundings, allowing our senses to adjust to the new environment and identify any unusual activity before exposing ourselves to the outside world. During those first 5 minutes of silent observation, I mentally registered various aspects of the scene unfolding before us. The October Arizona sun was still relatively high on the western horizon, casting long shadows that stretched from the ponderosa pines toward the house. The outside temperature, measured by the pickup's dashboard thermometer, read 24 degrees Celsius, ideal conditions for establishing our base camp without undue haste. Zeus remained seated in the passenger seat, but his posture immediately alerted me to something unusual about his usual behavior. Normally, when we arrived at a new campsite, he displayed visible excitement, shifting restlessly, sniffing the air coming in through the open windows, and occasionally making small sounds of anticipation. This time, he maintained a rigid posture, his ears erect and constantly rotating to catch sounds I couldn't detect. the house itself looked even more impressive than during our previous reconnaissance visits. The two-story structure, built primarily of local pine timber with a volcanic stone foundation and chimney, showed clear signs of 15 years of total neglect. The ground floor windows were all broken or removed entirely, with shards of glass scattered on the ground around the base of the building. The roof had multiple openings where wooden shingles had come loose or rotted, allowing vegetation to begin growing inside. Small shrubs emerged from some second-story windows, indicating that wind-borne seeds had found enough soil accumulated in the upper rooms to germinate and develop. The porch that ran around the entire perimeter of the house on the ground floor was partially collapsed in several spots, with wooden planks hanging at dangerous angles or completely fallen to the ground. Despite the evident deterioration, the main structure of the building appeared solid, confirming our previous assessment that it would be safe for temporary occupancy. After completing our initial observation, I stepped out of the pickup and immediately felt the difference in air quality compared to our base in Flagstaff. The slightly higher altitude and denser forest cover created a more humid, oxygen-rich atmosphere. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind in the pine canopies and the occasional distant sounds of small animals moving in the undergrowth. Zeus leaped from the vehicle and immediately began his standard perimeter reconnaissance protocol. Unlike his usual explorations, which were characterized by fluid movements and relaxed curiosity, this time he moved with deliberate caution, stopping frequently to test the air and stare in specific directions for prolonged periods. While Zeus conducted his initial inspection, I began unloading our gear from the pickup. The organization of supplies followed a specific sequence we had perfected over years of experience. First, the main backpacks containing essential survival supplies were removed and positioned near the main entrance to the house. Second, backup gear remained in the vehicle but was organized so that it could be quickly accessed in an emergency. The house's main entrance was located in the center of the south-facing front porch. The original solid wood door was still present, but hung on only one hinge, creating an irregular opening that allowed easy access to the interior. The porch steps were in poor condition, but still supported weight adequately when carefully tested. Before entering the house, I conducted a thorough visual inspection of the exterior structure to identify potential hazards. I looked for signs of wasp or bee nests, evidence of occupancy by wildlife such as squirrels or opossums, and any indication of structural instability that could create risks during our stay. The exterior inspection revealed some interesting features we hadn't noticed during our previous reconnaissance visits. Several windows showed deep scratches in the wood around the frames, as if large animals had tried to force their way in. The scratches were old, probably several years old, but they were too extensive to have been made by small rodents or squirrels. Even more intriguing was the complete absence of spider webs in the window openings. During 15 years of neglect in a forested environment, one would naturally expect significant accumulation of spider webs, especially in the weather-protected openings. The near-total absence of these natural indicators of insect occupancy suggested that something was regularly disturbing these areas. Zeus completed his perimeter inspection and returned to my location, but his behavior remained unusual. He positioned himself near my right leg, a position he normally assumed only when detecting potential threats. His ears remained erect and constantly moving, and he occasionally looked directly at me as if trying to communicate something specific. Entering the house was done with extreme caution. I tested each floorboard before transferring my weight completely, making sure the wood was solid enough to support both my weight and Zeus's. The interior was significantly darker than the exterior, even with the late afternoon light filtering through the open windows. The first room was a spacious living room with a high ceiling and an impressive volcanic stone fireplace dominating the north wall. The original furnishings were still present, but covered in thick layers of dust and organic debris that had entered through the roof vents over the years. A leather sofa faced the fireplace, with two armchairs flanking it at angles that allowed for comfortable conversation. The furniture arrangement created a natural space for us to establish our base camp. The area near the fireplace offered maximum protection from the elements, had only 2 access points that needed to be monitored, and provided multiple escape routes in case of an emergency. While I assessed the suitability of the main room for our purposes, Zeus began his own inspection of the house's interior. His behavior during this internal exploration was dramatically different from his actions outside. He moved with extreme caution, stopping frequently to intensively sniff specific areas of the floor, walls, and furniture. Particularly intriguing was his reaction to the leather sofa positioned facing the fireplace. Zeus approached the piece of furniture, sniffed extensively, took several steps back, and repeated this process 3 times before completely refusing to approach the piece again. In all the years of our partnership, I had never observed this specific pattern of behavior. Initial exploration of the other rooms on the ground floor revealed a kitchen with old utensils still hanging on the walls, a small office with a wooden desk covered in papers that had become illegible from exposure to moisture, and a bathroom with plumbing that had obviously not worked for many years. Every room bore signs of the Mueller family's hasty departure. Dirty dishes still piled high in the kitchen sink, now covered in a layer of green mold that had grown and then dried out several times over the years. Clothes were strewn across the office floor, as if someone had been desperately searching for something specific. In the bathroom, I discovered something particularly disturbing. The mirror above the sink was completely shattered, but not accidentally. The breakage patterns radiated from multiple impact points, suggesting it had been struck repeatedly and with considerable force. Shards of glass were still scattered on the floor around the base of the sink, some embedded so deeply in the wood that tools would be required to remove them. Zeus completely refused to enter the bathroom. He stopped in the doorway, sniffed the air, and immediately backed away, the fur on his spine slightly raised. This reaction was so unusual that I decided to mark the bathroom as a restricted area for the duration of our stay. The second floor of the house was accessible by a wooden staircase that, surprisingly, was still in solid condition. However, we decided to limit our initial exploration to the ground floor, establishing our base camp before exploring more remote areas of the structure. The organization of our base camp in the main room followed military protocols adapted for civilian survival operations. First, we established clear security perimeters, identifying all possible entry and exit routes. Second, we organized our supplies so that the most critical items were always within immediate reach. Third, we created designated positions where each of us would position ourselves during different potential scenarios. My backpack was positioned near the east wall of the room, where I could access it quickly, but where it was also protected from potential rain if the weather changed overnight. Zeus's backpack was placed adjacent to mine, allowing him to access his supplies when needed. The organization of supplies inside the backpacks was checked one last time to ensure each item was in the correct position for access in complete darkness. The tactical flashlight was positioned in the backpack's outer pocket, where it could be reached without having to open internal compartments. The first aid kit was moved to a similar position for quick access. Zeus received his first meal in his new environment at 6:15 p.m., following his normal feeding routine to minimize stress related to environmental changes. Interestingly, he consumed his food with less enthusiasm than usual, pausing several times to raise his head and look toward specific areas of the room. While Zeus ate, I began testing the fireplace's functionality to determine if it would be safe to use for heating overnight. The chimney appeared structurally sound with no visible obstructions, and the combustion chamber was clear of hazardous debris. There was even a small amount of dry firewood stacked near the hearth, apparently left by the original family. The initial fireplace test involved lighting a small amount of paper to verify that smoke rose adequately up the chimney without backflowing into the room. The test was successful, confirming that we could safely use the fireplace should nighttime temperatures necessitate heating. During these initial preparations, I carefully recorded in the logbook every unusual aspect we observed. Zeus's unusual behavior was particularly noteworthy, as never in our long partnership had I seen such consistently cautious reactions to a new environment. At 6:45 in the evening, once our basic setup was complete, we conducted our first joint perimeter security patrol since our arrival. This activity was intended to thoroughly familiarize us with the immediate terrain surrounding the house and establish safe travel routes during the hours of darkness. The immediate perimeter of the house revealed several features that would be relevant during our stay. A well-defined animal trail ran approximately 50 meters north of the structure, connecting a natural water source to more open grazing areas. This trail would likely be used by deer, elk, and potentially predators during the nighttime hours. To the east of the house, the land rose gradually toward a prominent rock formation that would provide excellent visibility of the surrounding area during the day, but would also create deep shadows after sunset. To the west, The land sloped gently down toward a valley covered in dense vegetation that would be completely invisible after dark. During this first detailed outdoor exploration, Zeus behaved more closely to his normal self, investigating interesting scents and occasionally marking his territory at strategic points. However, he continued to show a tendency to remain closer to me than usual during our explorations. Sunset in Arizona happens with the rapidity characteristic of low-latitude regions. Within about 30 minutes, the golden light of late afternoon was replaced by twilight, and 15 minutes later we were in near total darkness, broken only by the light of the crescent moon filtering through the treetops. It was during this transition to darkness that the first truly unusual signs began to manifest. Zeus, who had displayed merely cautious behavior during daylight hours, became visibly agitated as darkness fell completely over the property. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, as we were arranging our sleeping bags in the main room, Zeus abruptly ceased his activities and assumed a posture of full alert that I recognized from our military experiences. His ears pricked up, his body stiffened, and he directed his attention intently toward the stairwell area leading to the second floor. I remained motionless for several minutes, listening for any sound or movement that might have caught Zeus's attention. My human ears could detect nothing beyond the normal natural sounds of the night in the forest environment. The soft whisper of the wind, the occasional rustling of small animals in the vegetation outside, and the periodic creaks of the house's wood expanding and contracting with the changing temperatures. After approximately 5 minutes of maintaining a high alert posture, Zeus gradually relaxed, but he didn't return to the calm state that had characterized his demeanor during our initial hours on site. Instead, he established a constant vigilance, alternating his attention between the staircase, the open windows, and the main entrance of the house. This first episode of Unexplained Warning set the pattern for what would become an extraordinarily long and psychologically challenging night, during which Zeus and I would be tested in ways that no military training or previous survival experience had adequately prepared us for. The final setup of our base camp was completed at 8 o'clock that night, when we established 2-hour watch shifts that would allow us to maintain continuous security throughout the night, while ensuring we both got at least some rest. Zeus would be responsible for the continuous natural alertness his superior sensory ability provided, while I would maintain conscious vigilance during designated periods. With all preparations complete and complete darkness settled over the abandoned Miller family estate, Zeus and I were ready to face our first full night in the haunted house, with no idea that we were about to experience events that would challenge our sanity and courage in ways we had never imagined possible. At 8 o'clock in the evening, with our base of operations fully established in the main room of the abandoned house, Zeus and I began our first nightly surveillance routine. The crescent moon provided enough light to navigate the interior of the house without using our flashlights, conserving battery power for possible future emergencies. The temperature had dropped to approximately 18 degrees Celsius, comfortable enough to not require immediate heating from the fireplace. During the first hour of our stay in the darkness, I focused on calibrating my senses to the house's specific nocturnal environment. Every ancient structure develops its own nocturnal sound patterns, wood expanding and contracting, metal adjusting to temperature changes, small animals moving in hidden spaces. Understanding these normal sounds was essential to identifying any genuinely unusual activity that might occur during the following hours. The Miller house produced a distinctive symphony of structural noises. The roof beams emitted periodic creaks that followed a pattern related to changes in the outside temperature. The wooden floorboards responded to our movements with specific creaks that indicated which boards were loose or worn. Occasionally, gusts of wind would cause pieces of metal in the roof or windows to produce soft metallic sounds. Zeus strategically positioned himself near the center of the room, from where he could simultaneously observe the main entrance, the open windows, and the staircase leading to the second floor. His posture during this first hour was one of heightened attention, but not maximum alertness. His ears moved constantly, tracking sounds I couldn't detect, but his body remained relatively relaxed. During the second hour, between 9 and 10 p.m., I established our first silent communication system that we would use throughout the night. We developed simple hand signals that would allow me to instruct Zeus on different actions without producing sounds that might alert any outside wildlife to our presence. Similarly, I learned to interpret the specific body postures Zeus used to indicate different types of alerts or concerns. It was during this second hour that I recorded the first truly significant behavioral anomaly. Zeus abruptly stopped his routine surveillance and assumed a posture I had never seen in all the years of our partnership. He positioned himself facing the east wall of the room, where there were no windows or openings, and remained completely still for approximately 15 minutes. During these 15 minutes, Zeus didn't respond to my usual hand signals. He remained fixedly focused on something that apparently existed within or behind the solid wall. His ears were completely erect and motionless, suggesting he was listening for something very specific and constant, as opposed to their normal rotation to track varying sounds. I tried to position myself close to Zeus to see if I could detect any sound coming from the direction of his focused attention. For several minutes, I remained absolutely still, controlling my breathing and focusing all my hearing on the east wall. Occasionally, I thought I detected a very soft, rhythmic sound, almost like very controlled human breathing, but I could never be sure if it was real or a figment of my imagination, stimulated by Zeus's unusual behavior. After 15 minutes of this fixed posture, Zeus gradually relaxed and returned to his normal vigilance routine. However, throughout the rest of the night, he would periodically return his attention to the same area of the east wall, though never again with the same focused intensity he had demonstrated during this first episode. The third hour, from 10 to 11 p.m., was characterized by increased wildlife activity outside. The sounds of small nocturnal animals became more frequent and distinct. Occasionally he heard movements that suggested larger animals, possibly deer or elk, moving through the vegetation at considerable distances from the house. During this period, Zeus showed normal interest in many of the sounds outside, rotating his ears to track distant movement, and occasionally rising to approach open windows to investigate scents carried by the night breeze. This behavior was comforting because it represented his typical reactions to wild nighttime environments. However, at approximately 10:45 in the evening, all sounds of wildlife outside abruptly and simultaneously ceased. This sudden, complete stillness was a phenomenon I had experienced only a few times during decades of wilderness camping, usually indicating the proximity of a large predator that had alerted all smaller wildlife in the area. Zeus reacted immediately to this change in activity outside. He rose quickly and moved to a position near the front window of the house, assuming a defensive alert posture that indicated his preparation for potential confrontation. His nostrils flared as he intensively tested the night air, seeking to identify the source of the disturbance that had caused the sudden silence. For approximately 20 minutes, we maintained intense surveillance of the exterior of the house. I used my military experience to systematically examine every area visible through the windows, looking for movement, unusual shadows, or any visual indication of activity that might correspond to the cause of the animal's silence. Nighttime visibility was limited to approximately 30 meters from the house due to dense tree cover that partially blocked the moonlight. Within this visible area, I could detect no movement or presence that would adequately explain why all wildlife in the area had simultaneously ceased their normal activities. After 20 minutes of absolute silence, the normal sounds of nightlife gradually returned. Small rodents resumed their activities, followed by the more distant sounds of larger animals. Zeus relaxed his defensive posture but maintained a heightened awareness of the outside world for the remainder of the third hour. The fourth hour, from 11 p.m. to midnight, was marked by a change in the house's internal temperature that didn't match the external weather conditions. Although the outside temperature had stabilized at approximately 15 degrees Celsius, the interior of the main living area began to cool noticeably, eventually reaching a temperature I estimated to be at least 5 degrees cooler than the outside. This temperature difference was particularly unusual considering that the interior of structures typically maintains a more stable temperature than the exterior due to the insulation provided by the walls. The Miller house, despite its many openings due to deterioration, should still provide some thermal protection. Zeus reacted to this temperature change in a way that confirmed it wasn't a figment of my imagination. He moved closer to the central hearth, where temperatures would normally be slightly higher due to the thermal insulation provided by the stone mass. Additionally, he occasionally shivered slightly, a behavior that was unusual for him even in considerably lower temperatures. I decided to test the fireplace by lighting a small amount of the firewood that had been left by the original family. The fire caught easily and produced a comforting warmth that quickly warmed the immediate area around the fireplace. Interestingly, Zeus positioned himself close enough to the fire to receive its warmth, but he didn't assume the relaxed posture he typically exhibited when warmed by a comfortable heat source. During the 5th hour, from midnight to 1 in the morning, events began to take on characteristics that defied conventional explanation. It was during this hour that both Zeus and I began detecting sounds coming from the 2nd floor of the house, sounds that did not correspond to any normal structural settlement or wildlife activity. The sounds were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. They consisted of very soft noises that could have been interpreted as small rodents moving through the space between the walls. However, the patterns were too regular and rhythmic to be produced by random animal activity. Zeus detected these sounds several hours before I could hear them clearly. Around 12:15 a.m., he began showing increasing interest in the stairwell area, occasionally rising and moving a few steps toward the 2nd floor before stopping and returning to his primary surveillance position. When I finally became consciously aware of the sounds, at approximately 12:45 in the morning, they had become slightly more distinct. They seemed to consist of very deliberate and controlled movements, as if someone were walking very cautiously through the rooms on the 2nd floor, trying to minimize the noise they were making. The regularity of these sounds was disturbing. They occurred at intervals of approximately 2 to 3 minutes, always following the same pattern. A series of 3 to 4 very soft footsteps, a pause of approximately 30 seconds, and then a repetition of the same pattern. The consistency suggested intentionality rather than random natural causes. Zeus reacted to these sounds with a level of alertness that approximated his reactions during real combat situations. He positioned himself facing the stairs and assumed a posture that indicated preparation for immediate defensive action. His nostrils worked constantly, testing the air for any odor that might accompany the mysterious sounds. During this 5th hour, I made a conscious decision not to directly investigate the source of the sounds from the 2nd floor. My military experience had taught me that premature investigations of potentially dangerous situations often create unnecessary vulnerabilities. It was preferable to maintain our advantageous defensive position in the main room, while gathering more information about the nature of the suspicious activity. The 6th hour, from 1 to 2 in the morning, brought a significant escalation in the intensity and frequency of the unexplained phenomena. The sounds from the 2nd floor became more audible and began to include noises that suggested movement of objects beyond simple footsteps. At approximately 1:15 a.m., I began detecting sounds that sounded like furniture being moved very carefully through the upstairs rooms. These noises were characterized by periods of gentle friction, as if heavy objects were being slowly dragged across the wooden floor. Zeus responded to this escalation in activity with behavior he had never displayed during any of our previous experiments. He began making very low, almost inaudible, guttural sounds, which I recognized as his most serious warning vocalization. These sounds were different from his normal growls, and were only used when he detected threats he considered extremely dangerous. During the 2nd half of the 6th hour, the sounds from the 2nd floor began to include elements that could not be easily attributed to structural or animal causes. Occasionally he detected what seemed to be very soft vocalizations, almost whispers, that were too indistinct to identify specific words, but which had rhythmic and tonal qualities that suggested attempts at communication. Zeus's reaction to these possible vocalizations was particularly intense. Each time